Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Freya, the Eye of the Storm, and so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Freya is a melee DPS champion who excels in dealing lots of burst melee damage with her twin hammers. Freya has some very good options to close the gap between her and her enemies, and so she's pretty good at sticking to her enemies to dish out melee damage. When she can stay in range, she can dish out quite a lot of damage if left unchecked, and so Freya is definitely not a champion to underestimate. In terms of survivability, Freya doesn't have a lot of sustain built into her kit. In fact, she doesn't have any healing at all, and so she'll have to rely on pickups or support teammates for healing. Having said that though, she does generate a lot of damage shields from her abilities, and this is her primary form of sustain. To compensate for the lack of healing, she also has numerous invincibility frame abilities, making her extremely hard to deal with when she is played correctly. And so Freya is quite a well-rounded champion, I would say. She is by no means a beginner-friendly champion because it will take a while to fully grasp what every single one of her ability does, and she does need a lot of practice to play effectively as well. Before we start, just like the other champion guides I have made previously for Croak and Rook to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections and have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you've already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Freya's abilities before talking about her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Then we'll look at her Battlerites options, and finally we'll finish off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Freya. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about her abilities one by one. Freya's left click or mouse 1 ability is Bash, and this is her basic melee attack. When attacking an enemy without the static debuff, the ability will deal 10 damage per hit. If the enemy has the static debuff on them, then her mouse 1 hits will deal an extra 2 bonus damage instead, making it so that her hits are that much more deadly. Because of this, it is likely that enemies will use some sort of escape or an out to try to get away from Freya if Freya managed to get close, since it is just too much damage to take for almost no cost for Freya. If you are wondering, the static debuff is a debuff that Freya can apply to her enemies when hitting them with some of her other abilities. It is crucial that you understand what every ability can do with and without the static debuff, and which abilities apply or remove the static debuff to really make the most out of Freya. This is part of the reason why Freya is a difficult champion to master and play well, I feel. Anyway, moving on. Freya's right click or mouse 2 ability is Storm Mace, and this is her main ranged ability. It has a rather low cooldown, and what it does is Freya will throw a hammer forward, so basically it is just a simple ranged projectile attack. This will be Freya's main way of poking at the enemy, and also her main hard CC ability. When hitting an enemy without the static debuff on them, it will simply do some damage while applying the static debuff onto them. If it hits an enemy inflicted with the static debuff though, the static debuff will be consumed and the enemy will be knocked back a large distance. If they get knocked back into a wall, they will be incapacitated for 2 seconds, allowing Freya or her teammates to freely line up their other abilities. Pretty sweet. Because of its relatively low cooldown, you'll be spamming this fairly often and also trying to use it to in-cap enemies as often as you can. Next up, Freya's spacebar ability is Spring, and what it does is Freya basically does a little jump forward and she'll gain some increased movement speed after that jump to allow her to catch up to her enemies. Furthermore, her first mouse 1 hit on an enemy after that jump deals some bonus damage, and so it is a pretty decent aggressive move. During the jump, Freya is actually invulnerable for a short while, and so it can be used defensively as well to avoid hard hitting abilities. So all in all, a pretty decent dual function ability. A lot of combos which Freya can do will rely on this ability, but it will be a topic for later in the video. Moving on, Freya's Chyill ability is her counter ability, and it is called Electric Shield. When activated, Freya prepares to counter, and if it is triggered by an enemy melee attack or projectile attack, the attackers will be pulled towards Freya and will be inflicted with a static debuff. At the same time, Freya will also be given a shield for successfully countering attacks, which is very handy for Freya's survival. Being able to anticipate enemy attacks and use this ability is pretty crucial when playing Freya, since you will not only pull enemies out of position, but it is also a free gap closer and they will be forced to use an escape ability to get out there if they don't want to be hurt too badly. After that, Freya can proceed to chase them down and punish them, since they will be out of escapes at that point, so pretty useful ability I would say. When using this ability, Freya will channel the whole 1 seconds if she is not interrupted, and so if you do successfully manage to counter an attack and pull someone to you, you might be standing around doing nothing for up to 1 second when you could be doing damage while they are near you. This is a waste, and so you should definitely cancel the counter ability yourself with C and immediately start punishing the enemy for hitting your counter. Typically, a good move to combo into right after pulling enemies in with your Q is to use Freya's E ability right after that, which we will talk about now. Freya's E ability is Thunderclap, and this is Freya's main AoE ability. What it does is Freya will jump into the air for a short while before landing and dealing some damage to enemies around her. Because Freya is actually invulnerable while jumping, this ability can be used defensively to avoid hard hitting abilities too, just like her spacebar ability. Even if you don't hit any enemies, it is still pretty worth it since you don't really want to take too much damage as Freya, as you can't heal it back up yourself. Enemies that are hit by this ability will also be inflicted by the static debuff in addition to the damage that is dealt to them. But if they already have the static debuff on them, then they will just be dealt some extra bonus damage, which may be significant. What's important to note is that this ability doesn't consume the static debuff on the enemy, and so you can actually proceed to mouse 2 onto an enemy to incapacitate them after that. Very nice. I'll definitely go into more details on combos with Freya later in the video, so stay tuned for that, okay? Those were all of Freya's abilities that doesn't cost energy, so now let us move on to those which do. Freya's R ability is Charged Strike, and this ability costs 25 energy to use. What it does is Freya will do an AoE melee attack in front of her, which deals some pretty good damage, I must say. What's more important is that it will also generate a shield for Freya for each enemy hit, drastically improving her survivability for a few seconds. If the enemies hit have the static debuff on them, the static debuffs will be consumed, but the shield generated from that hit will be doubled, giving an even more massive survivability boost. Definitely a very good ability to use when you expect to be brawling it out with an enemy, and you also expect to take quite a few hits from the enemy. Moving on, Freya's first EX ability is her EX Shift Space ability, Shock Vault. The ability costs 25 energy, and what it does is Freya will leap forward while gaining movement speed, just like her normal spacebar ability, but this time the first mouse 1 hit on an enemy after jumping will not only deal more damage, but it will also inflict a fading snare and the static debuff on the enemy hit. The ability is definitely a very good aggressive ability, since the snare will help Freya stick to the enemy and the static debuff will help make her other abilities that much more lethal. If you don't expect to be using Freya's ultimate much, it is definitely worth spending some energy on this ability to hunt down a key target on your enemy team, I feel. Just make sure you keep at least 25 energy to use her EXE ability that we will get to now, since it is really good. Freya's EX Shift E ability is Thunder Slam, and it costs 25 energy to use. What it does is that Freya will jump up, just like in her normal E ability, with the invincibility frame and everything, before landing and dealing AoE damage in a line in front of her. Enemies hit by the ability will be inflicted with the fading snare and static debuffs, so it is definitely very powerful for initiating on an enemy. Because the ability is really a ranged AoE ability, it can often be used to first avoid an enemy ability with a jump, then deal damage, snare, and inflict the static debuff on the enemy. This is all in one ability, and that's why I think it is super powerful. Not only that, if the enemy is already affected by the static debuff, the damage the ability will deal will be even higher. Because the ability is an AoE ability, it doesn't even trigger counters, and so it is very effective for finishing off enemies too. Definitely Freya's best ability, I would say, and will be a part of a few combos that you can pull off with Freya. Finally, last but not least, is Freya's ultimate ability on the F key, and it is called Lightning Strike. It costs 100 energy, and basically Freya jumps up so high that she is no longer in the map for a while, before striking down on a large targeted area to deal massive damage to enemies caught within it. Enemies hit by the ultimate will also be inflicted with the static debuff, so that Freya can continue the aggression after that. If the enemies hit by the ultimate already have static applied, then it will deal quite a large amount of bonus damage as well, while refreshing the static debuff. Super simple but powerful. When using this ability, just remember to make sure that the enemies have already used up their escapes, since it is really easy for them to avoid the ability otherwise. Personally, I feel the ability is best used on an incapacitated enemy for maximum effect when you're not sure whether enemies have an ult available or not. It is often better to use Freya's energy for her other abilities instead, since all of her other abilities that require energy are all very good as well, and Freya definitely doesn't have as much killing power without some energy at least. So yeah, for flashy kills, the ultimate is a very good way to do it, but for more consistent play, I think you'll probably want to use her energy for her other abilities. And so that's about it for Freya's abilities. Now let us move on to her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Freya's playstyle is mostly an aggressive one. because she doesn't have any form of real sustain and healing in her kit. She needs to make sure she's proactively damaging enemies when she can, and shielding herself with her abilities as much as possible to try to reduce the amount of damage that she takes in return. And so basically what you're effectively looking for when playing Freya is to look for favourable conditions for you to engage on the enemy and make trades against them. So long as you deal more damage than they did to you, you're in a pretty good spot. Most of Freya's abilities are on a low cooldown, so this makes it a lot easier for Freya to find chances to engage on the enemy, since she is more likely to have her abilities ready each time as compared to her enemies. Just try to keep in mind that you're meant to avoid damage when playing as Freya as well while you're trying to deal damage, so just be careful. When trying to engage on an enemy as Freya, the most ideal way of engaging is for the enemy to hit your counter and you pull them to you this way. This is much better than jumping in with Freya's spacebar, since you'll be left with one less escape at a point, which might not be ideal. Typically, you will only want to use spacebar to jump in if you see a perfect opportunity to jump in and try to do something. Sometimes doing risky moves like this is essential, since it is usually very good for you if it pays off, but you might have to be a bit more alert and cautious when you do jump in this way. If you play Freya passively and wait around too long for a chance, you typically lose out because your long range poke isn't as strong as others and you don't have any self-sustain at all, so definitely try to make things happen as Freya. So yeah, that's the mindset you sort of have to have when playing Freya. Because of how Freya has to combo her abilities in different ways with all those static debuffs and stuff, I can't really go into too much detail on how and when to use her abilities at this point, so I'll talk more about that later on in the gameplay tips and combos section of the video after we've covered her Battlerites. With that said, let's move on to her strengths and weaknesses now. Starting with her strengths, I think that one of Freya's strengths is her ability to really disrupt the enemies. Her spacebar, Q and E abilities all cause quite a bit of disruption to the enemies, especially when you're in their face, trying to deal as much damage as you can. If you realize, games involving Freya often feel a bit more hectic, and the reason for this is that because of how Freya is able to pull enemies about, jump up once in a while to avoid damage and all that, and all of this really messes up the enemy's flow if you know what you're doing with Freya. I say that this is a strength because while you're doing all of that, it is easy for your teammates to take advantage of your enemy's lack of attention toward them and really deal some good damage to your enemies. When you're trying hard to deal with the Freya chasing you down, you will find that it is really hard to keep track of what Freya's teammate is trying to do to you, so it is definitely a strength, I would say. Moving on, I think Freya is also very strong against most other melee champions. It is very hard for melee enemies in general to deal with her because of the amount of invincibility frames that Freya has, as well as the amount of interrupts that she has within her abilities. A good example for this is her E ability, since she can effectively avoid hard-hitting melee abilities while dealing damage to the enemies around her after she lands. If she finds that she's losing the trade, a simple mouse tool onto an enemy will push them away to give her some space to breathe for a while, since it is very likely that the static debuff will be applied to the enemy anyway. So yeah, Freya's pretty good when it comes to trading against melee enemies. Next up, I think that Freya is also pretty good at applying lots of pressure on low health enemies. Freya is pretty mobile with her spacebar ability, and to couple that with her ability to pull enemies in with her Q ability, her multiple snares from her EXE and EX space ability, and her in-cap from her mouse tool, she can really stick to enemies very easily and can very easily apply lots of pressure onto enemies. Even if they are not low health, Freya is one of the best candidates to chase down a single enemy and really try to bring them down as quickly as possible. A bit like Ismo, but a melee version basically, and we all know how annoying it is to constantly be chased down by, well, Ismo or Freya. So yeah, I think that this is one of Freya's strengths because it really makes it hard for the enemy to do their thing with, a Freya chasing behind all the time. So those were some of Freya's strengths. Now let us talk about some of her weaknesses. I think that Freya is a little bit weak in poking and long range engagements. I'm sure you would have realized this by now as well, since she only really has her mouse tool to poke and it only deals 12 damage per hit. The range of it isn't very far, and so Freya really has to get close and try to do something meaningful, which can sometimes be difficult if both enemies are very long range champions. At that point, you will need to rely on them hitting your counters, and this can prove to be quite unreliable sometimes. Moving on, I think that Freya is also quite weak at contesting for the center orb. Sure, she has very strong presence and can apply a lot of pressure onto enemies trying to fight for the orb, but what she lacks is the burst damage to really bring down the orb efficiently. All of Freya's abilities deal between 10 to 20 damage, minus her ultimate of course, and so it might be hard for her to fight for the orb straight up. She will need to position herself in between enemy opponents and the orb to really get a chance at the orb, especially if her teammate is nowhere nearby. Losing health as Freya is the last thing you want to do if you don't have a healer in the team, and so it can be quite bad if you overcommit into getting the orb. And I think this is a pretty major downside for Freya, unfortunately. Finally, I think that one weakness of Freya's is that it is very easy to misplay with Freya and then you get punished because of it. Freya relies quite a bit on fast reflexes, whether to get people to hit her counter or to think on the fly what abilities to use next and stuff like that, and so I think that when she makes a wrong move, it is easy for her to receive too much damage and the game will be quite tough after that. This is especially true if you have no healer teammate to reduce that sort of room for error, and so I think this is one of her weaknesses. You just require so much attention and focus when playing with Freya that it can sometimes be quite tiring to play Freya, non-stop. So I suppose that's definitely one of her weaknesses, I would say. And so yeah, that's about it for her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now let us move on to Freya's Battlerites options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerites if you wish, before I go through my thoughts on her Battlerites, since it will take a long while for me to read it all out for you. And so pause now to read them all. Okay, now that you've read them all, let's continue. In the first tier, I think that all three Battlerites are pretty good, but with Charge Lightning being my personal favourite. Twin Hammers allow for a more poke-oriented, passive playstyle, so if you're more into that kind of playstyle with Freya, it can be pretty okay. But as I mentioned, Freya is meant to be played aggressively, since she doesn't have a lot of sustain, so if you want to use Twin Hammers, I think it would probably be better in a team with at least a healer, so that you can afford to lose some health once in a while. The Twin Hammers Battlerites makes it quite a bit easier to incapacitate enemies, and so it can be pretty good in constantly making the fight a 2 vs 1 fight, with the almost perma incaps on some of the maps with more walls available for you to knock enemies into. Torrent gives some nice shields, as well as the utility of pulling enemies closer, but I would say it is probably the weaker Battlerites among the three. It is fairly hard to hit Freya's E on a non-stationary target, and so it can be inconsistent to get this Battlerites to give you shields unless you have already pulled enemies in with your Chyill ability. My view on this Battlerites is that it can be useful when perhaps you're up against more than one melee enemy, then it can be pretty useful since your enemies will tend to be near you as well, and landing those E abilities are that much easier. Finally, Charge Lightning, my favourite Battlerites this tier, lets you be super aggressive with playing Freya. Having this Battlerites opens up a lot of combo potential, and I mean a lot, and it is also super disruptive to the enemies since they will be stunned so often. The stun being an AoE stun cancels counters, disrupts channeling, and gives you enough time to at least get one free hit in, which is always super. The only downside to the ability is that you need to use your space to engage rather than disengage, and so if you mess up some abilities and the enemy retaliates, it is more likely for you to lose the trade than to win it, so do use it with caution. But even having said that though, most of the time it is hard to miss with your spacebar ability, and so it is usually worth it as you can pull out lots of fun and aggressive moves with it. As I said earlier, I'll go into more details about Freya's combos soon in the next section of the guide. Moving on, in the second tier, I think some decent options as well. For more survivability and team play, Overcharge is very good for the extra shields and survivability. Spreading the static around is also quite nice since you can usually follow up with some aggression after the Q ability, so that's pretty good as well. If you pick Twin Hammers in the first round, Thunderbolt can be pretty good as well. With the Twin Hammers picked in the first round, you'll typically be trying to hit 2 mouse 2 hits onto the same enemy in succession, and so those extra damage from the second mouse 2 adds up. It definitely makes Freya more viable at a longer distance with this Battlerites. I would say though that it is probably not worth picking Thunderbolt up if you didn't pick Twin Hammers, since the other choices would be much better picks in that case, and Thunderbolt would be a bit lackluster, as you would need to rely on other means of applying static on the enemy. Finally, Storm is I think the pick that I take most of the time for my playstyle. Using Q and having an enemy hit the counter, followed by a Thunderclap on top of them is a very good way of dealing 20 damage just like that. The short snare is also good to help you deal even more with some mouse 1 hits, so it's pretty solid Battlerites I would say, at least for offensive users. In the third round, I think that all 3 Battlerites are also quite okay again. Freya definitely has some good Battlerites diversity because of how much choice it has. It is arguable that depending on which build you go for, you really don't have that much choice after that since you're going for a certain kind of build, but it is at least commendable to the devs that you at least have a few builds for a single champion, even though some of them is not as strong as another. The diversity is there at least. Anyway, back to the Battlerites. If you pick Twin Hammers and is going for the mouse 2 build, Tempest is good since you get a nice movement speed buff for both offensive and defensive purposes. Surge is pretty decent as well if you can reliably get enemies to proc your counters, since the best time to use R is when enemies are drawn in by your Q and you just use your R right on top of them. The ability is definitely helpful since it means more shields and more energy for you, provided you can consistently land your R ability casts on at least one enemy. In most cases though, Electric Conduction is the best pick I think, even though the other two are quite okay. The shield you get after jumping and hitting an enemy with a mouse 1 is very valuable, especially if you are going for a very aggressive playstyle with Freya, and so it is definitely a very high value Battleright. Every damage blocked by your shields is every damage you don't need your teammate to heal up for you, and the less pressure you are under. It is also hard enough to maintain the focus you need to play Freya, so you definitely want to reduce the amount of pressure you are under by being at a higher health amount as much as possible. In the 4th tier, I think that Storm Cloud is okay if you're going for the mouse 2 build and enemies tend to stick closer together. So what I mean is that if the enemy team is 2 melees or 2 ranged, they will tend to be closer together and it will be easier for you to get value out of Storm Cloud. If there's a high value range target in the enemy team that you typically want to focus down first, then agility is your best bet in trying to stick to them to pressure them. If the enemy team has sticky melee champions who are after your support or something, then negative charge can be pretty good too, to try to help out your teammate a little bit. Just throwing a mouse 2 at an enemy melee chasing after your teammate helps quite a bit for them, so it is definitely not a bad Battleright. And finally, in the 5th and final tier, both Battlerites are pretty good I would say. Thunderstruck is the more offensive one, and you can definitely go for that to make it easier to finish enemies off. A 1 second stun is pretty huge, so it's definitely very powerful. If you're having trouble surviving, then Lightning Blast will help a little bit with those shields, so it is definitely a good pickup as well. Just depends on what you need really. And so yeah, that's about it on Freya's Battlerites. Now let us move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Freya, as well as some potential combos with her. My first tip for playing Freya is to really get used to some of her combos. For my other guides, I usually go through some tips before covering some combos for champions, but for this time, because the combos are quite integral to Freya's effectiveness, since you really want to be able to dish out as much damage as you can when you're able to, we'll go through some useful combos first, then we'll talk about the rest of the tips. Most of the combos that I have to share with you guys will probably make use of the stun on impact from the Charged Lightning Battleright in the first round, and so be sure to pick that Battleright if you want to pull off some of these combos. Some combos can certainly be done even without the Battleright, but it may not be as consistent since the 0.5 second stun really helps with stringing the abilities together, as well as interrupting the enemies for you to deal more damage to them. The first combo I have for you is to use Q, get the enemy to trigger the counter followed by E, spacebar right on top of the enemy, and then do some mouse 1s for damage, or mouse 2 for the in-cap if a wall is nearby. The combo is very effective since you can potentially hit more than one enemy if multiple enemies hit your counter at around the same time. Of course, it is not possible to get enemies to trigger your counters all the time, but when it does work, it is a lot of damage that you can deal to them. If enemies have their escapes ready, then it is likely that they will jump away before you can E on top of them, but at least now they have wasted an escape and you still have your spacebar to chase after them. Another combo I have for you to initiate onto an enemy is to mouse 2 onto them and then spacebar on top of them for a stun, followed by a mouse 1 and then immediately an E after that. At that point you can use R if you think you need the shields, or you can just continue to mouse on them for more damage. If you think you need to use your counter, go ahead and use it as well since it pulls enemies back to you and it gives you shields as well. The only downside for this combo is that you use your spacebar early, and so if you mess up or something and now enemies are coming after you, it may be hard to get away without getting damaged. So these two combos are my typical basic combos I use for when I want to engage onto my enemies, and there are a few other mini combos that I will share with you now, but before I get to that, I just want to say that Freya is really a champion that you want to be able to think and react on the fly. Many times halfway through a combo or something, you need to react to what enemies do, and sometimes you need to do something else more appropriate for that situation, and so for this reason you need to really understand each of her abilities to react properly in those situations. A few mini combos that you can do is the Shift E into mouse 2 combo for a quick in-cap. If you see an enemy near to a wall and you want to quickly in-cap them, this is a good way of doing it if you don't have the Twin Hammers Battleright. It is also very useful for hitting enemies out of bounds in sudden death time, and so that's another use for the combo. When trying to use your ultimate, trying to in-cap an enemy first is always good, so the best way I feel to really be able to do this is to Q an enemy into you while inflicting static, and then mouse 2 them into a wall followed by your ultimate. so that's another mini combo that might be useful. When trying to deal with melee champions trying to use their counters or shield abilities next to you, using E followed by a spacebar on top of them for the stun is pretty good too. Both these abilities are AoE, and so you should be able to damage and stun them to interrupt their counter before you continue to hit them a few more times with your mouse 1 attacks. Another way that you can combo to engage with your spacebar ability is to shift E first and then spacebar onto them and then mouse to them later on for an incap, or just proceed to mouse 1 them a few times and then mouse to them for an incap. So that's just another variation to the combo that I mentioned earlier where you can initiate with your spacebar ability. So yeah, those are just a few of the more basic and useful combos out of the many potential combos that you can do with Freya. These are simple enough but very effective, and so definitely try to learn them if you can. I may not have listed down everything since after all I don't know everything about her as well, but it is a good enough starting point and you should definitely experiment a bit with some, and you can certainly discover some in the heat of a fight as well sometimes as you're trying to improvise to the situation before you. Phew, that was a lot of combos and stuff, so let's get back to the gameplay tips. My next tip for you, now that we know some of the combos that Freya can pull off, is to try to put some of them to good use, to really pressure the enemies a lot. I mentioned about how Freya needs to be aggressive and really try to apply lots of pressure to the enemies, right? Since these combos are mostly aggressive in nature, you can definitely try to make use of some of them and as quickly as you can deal as much damage as you can to the enemy. It is really quite important to pressure a lot with Freya, and I repeat it a few times this video is because she is quite weak from afar and she has no healing. So poking and trying to play the long game is disadvantageous to her unless you have a good healer in the team. Moving on, another tip when playing Freya is to really try to be in the zone when playing her. Using the Qs in time needs good focus and reflexes, and trying to time those iframes while dealing some damage with those abilities at the same time takes a bit of effort, and so definitely try to be on your top form when playing Freya. Any mistakes mean unnecessary damage, and it means you need to heal up somehow, so that's not very fun. Also, another useful tip is to get used to hitting her mouse 2s. It's her only source of consistent range damage, and the static debuff you put on people really helps you out a lot since you can use that for your other abilities. Her mouse 2 is sort of a static debuff applier all the time, except when you're trying to incap the person of course, and so definitely get used to aiming it. It matters even more when you're trying to incap people with it in fact, since you need to make sure you hit it and they get knocked back into a wall, so definitely practice it a lot. Games are a lot, and I mean a lot, easier if you can manage to incap enemies multiple times around. So yeah, practice those M2s. Definitely also try to be ready to react on the fly and be ready to use the right abilities at the right time even if they're not part of a combo you already know, since you may be surprised with the results sometimes. In terms of teammates, I think that teammates that perform a lot better when not being focused are good teammates for Freya. Preferably they can heal as well, so that Freya doesn't have to worry about her health bar as much. So some good examples of this is Jumong, Taya for champions that can deal loads of damage when they are not being focused down, and some supports that go quite well with Freya is Sirius for more aggressiveness, or like Pestilus and Odo for ranged supports. Melees get in the way of each other, and so I seldom recommend multiple melee comps, but Sirius is okay I guess since he heals and he only needs to occasionally be in melee range to do some burst damage. And so overall, while I think that Freya is a champion that is pretty hard to learn and hard to master as well, once you do get a good feel of her abilities and her playstyle, she really is very fun to play because of how fast paced she is, and games are always exciting when playing with Freya. I tried playing Freya when I first started playing the game and I couldn't understand how to get her to work, but now with more experience in the game, learning her was so much easier, and so if you're having troubles playing with Freya, don't hesitate to try other champions out first and come back to her next time. Even if it's just for a few hours or something, a little break to give your mind a bit of a rest when playing Freya can potentially help you do better since you'll be more fresh and alert after some rest. That's my advice at least. And so yeah, that's about it for my Freya guide. I hope you found it useful. I've tallied up the polls on my Rook guide and it seems like a Pestilus guide should be up next. However, as I mentioned in my 0.1.2.1 patch video, I will slot the updated Jumong guide in between Freya and Pestilus's guide, and so the next Battlerites guide video should be on Jumong before we move on to Pestilus. If you want to vote for which champion guide I will do next after Pestilus's guide, you can do so by clicking the I button at the top right now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel, like it, comment on it, share this video, and you can check out my other videos as well if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, keep on gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.